Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our first roundtable of the conference, which deals with regional security. And we have, through our terrific cooperation with the George C. Marshall Center in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, a well-developed panel of specialists who hail from 4 different countries to talk about regional security. Our panelists hail from the United Kingdom, from the US, from Hungary, and of course from Poland, because particularly at this conference, no panel would be complete without at least one Polish representative. So we're happy that we can listen to what will be, I'm sure, a very, very good presentation and discussion, which of course we will invite you to ask questions of our specialists after they're finished. So let me find the right page so I can say a few words about our panelists, and then we'll begin our discussion. And here we are. The representative of the Marshall Center with whom I've been communicating before this meeting so that this conference would become the raging success that it is Matthew Rhodes, who is sitting here in the middle. He's a professor of national security studies at the Marshall Center. He's been at a number of other institutions as well. And his interests are U.S. foreign and security policy, transatlantic relations, and Central and Southeast European security issues, which suits us to a T. Graeme is sitting to my right. He's a professor of transnational security studies also at the Marshall Center, and the founding director of the School of Government and associate dean in the Faculty of Business, Plymouth University. He was a founder of the Center for Sea Power and Strategy at the Britannia Royal Naval Academy in Dartmouth, and he will be our first speaker. Paul Dunay is sitting next to Matthew Rhodes. He's a professor of NATO and European security issues at the Marshall Center. He's worked at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. He reopened and directed the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs and was director of the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe's Academy in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. He's been around the block. And he's a specialist on European security and East Central Europe and Eastern Europe and Central Asia, the OSCE, and the legality of the use of force. Our last speaker is from Krakow, where he received his PhD and became a professor in the Middle and Far East Studies Institute, Department of Political and International Studies of the Jagiellonian University. And so he would fit in another panel very nicely. We have room for you if you're available. He has a long and distinguished career in the administration in Poland. He served on a number of special units of various ministries. He has a great deal of experience in security studies, and of course he's a great specialist on the new security doctrine that Poland just published and just became public 2 weeks ago. Since 2016, he's the Deputy Director of the Military Foreign Affairs Department and advisor of the Minister of National Defense, and is his plenipotentiary for the Strategic Defense Review that I mentioned. So he knows what the Polish armed forces are about. I'd like to ask Graeme to begin our discussion, and if you could hold your remarks to about 12 minutes, that would be good.
Well, thank you, John. I'm delighted to be in Warsaw on this panel. When I first graduated with a PhD and had my first academic post, the first international conference I went to was in Wrocław, and I obviously had to travel through Warsaw, so it's really nice to be back. And I hope the paper I give now is much better than the paper I gave in Wrocław when I was young and dangerously good looking, as I like to think of myself. Okay, so I'm going to try and look at how do we understand the rationality, the logic of Russia's foreign policy, particularly destabilization efforts, and how sustainable is this? Is it something that's been going on but will gradually diminish, or is it set to stay as it is or even increase? Those are the key questions I'm looking at. To try and understand Russia's foreign policy, I think we need to look into the domestic, economic, political, social system that's been created by a system-forming figure, that is President Putin. And the two key data points here really are two strategic vulnerabilities that Russia has to deal with. The first is the hydrocarbon dependence. 50% of exports, or 50% of, GDP, 70% of exports, 98% of corporation tax. The vulnerability is that Russia cannot affect the price of oil globally. So if oil's at 110 or oil's at $25, Russia can't do anything about that price, and that is the vulnerability. Second vulnerability is the popularity of the president. When Putin has demodernized Russia, deinstitutionalized and deglobalized Russia, it means that if his popularity decreases, then you have a kind of existential crisis within the federation. If not Putin, who? There's no contingency plans, no succession mechanism to replace the leader. So essentially we're looking at Russia's foreign policy operating in a context where the economy is here in the toilet, basically, 0.2% average GDP growth since 2009, 2012 zero growth, and since 2012 it's gone down. This is when Kudrin resigned from the government. So the economy is here and the popularity of the president is here. This is a very abnormal context. Normally, the popularity of a president, as happened in the first 8 years of Putin's presidency from 2000-2008, tracks the economy, maybe lags a little bit behind. As the economy increases, so the popularity. So this is very abnormal politics. But within this context, destabilization makes a lot of sense. It's a policy for a weak economy, a foreign policy for a weak economy, a foreign policy for the high popularity of the president, and it's a foreign policy which is cheap and gives you a very good return on investment. So it works, in other words. And to understand really strategically, I think, what Russia's doing, it's interesting to look at von Clausewitz and his book On War. Clausewitz, as we know, was an officer in Russian and Prussian military service. And he introduces the concept of a Schwerpunkt, or center of gravity. And if you think of the center of gravity of Russia in lieu of an economy that functions and political system, the center of gravity in Russia is the belief of the people in the necessity of a strong leader who can patrol the frontier, guard the besieged fortress against external enemies, the good Tsar, who holds the line, while the bad boyars, the government, muck up the economy. So the necessity of a strong leader, destabilization, must be able to defend and advance that notion. And secondly, if you look at center of gravity attack or offense center of gravity, we're looking at Russia destabilizing market democratic systems and states and their center of gravity, which again is an intangible center of gravity. It's not a building or a monument, it's the belief in the integrity, for example, of democratic election systems, of solidarity, of democratic values, transparency, accountability, etc., etc. So when we look at Russia's use of conventional and sub-conventional tools, conventional tools being the presidency, presidential administration, state-controlled economy and companies, state-controlled civil society, the diplomatic corps, the intelligence services, the media, etc. When we look at Russia's foreign policy, we see all of these actors having a role and function in attacking the center of gravity of the West, the political West, but defending Russia's center of gravity. And we see intelligence services acting as a linchpin to sub-conventional actors that Russia can use. Support to and from anti-status quo parties, for example, in Europe. Weaponizing history and identity, the use of frozen conflicts, weaponizing migrants and refugees, the use of transnational organized criminal groups, corruption, the kind of Kremlin's playbook. The CSIS study captures some of this very well in 5 states in the region. And also the use of strategic proxy forces. such as ultras or Kadyrovsky, or private military corporations, Moran Group, RBS Group in Libya, Wagner Group in Syria, for example, or the Balkan Cossack army, so-called, that ran the coup last year in Montenegro, or a Baltic civil army, so-called, in the Baltic states. So there's many examples you can look at of these particular subconventional strategic proxy forces. And essentially you have a foreign policy then that is deniable, or the destabilization elements are deniable. It washes its face, so to speak, to use an English expression. It pays for itself if you're using the operation also to have money laundering going on. And it's the evidence, I think, of the utility of this foreign policy you see in state discourse. If you listen to Sergei Lavrov or President Putin or some of the propagandists in the Senate and the Parliament, the Duma, State Duma of Russia, you basically see two types of narratives or discourses. One leads or buttresses this idea of center of gravity defense, and one center of gravity attack. So for example, you often hear the expression, things may be bad in Russia, but they're worse in the West. You know, go to Berlin and you'll be raped, as the Lisa case propaganda tried to demonstrate. This is one part of the discourse. The idea that Russia's a great power. To sacrifice is to be a great power. We need to sacrifice more if we're to rise from our knees. That they fear us for our greatness. They're scared of and therefore try and harm us because we are great. This is the kind of internal, we're a besieged fortress, we're under threat. It's your duty, your patriotic duty, to have military patriotic mobilization around Alexander Nevsky, who is in fact President Putin. This is the tradition that's being played upon. And in foreign policy terms, or externally, the center of gravity attack, Lavrov often says there can be no European security without Russia. In other words, if you don't give us Yalta-Potsdam II or Helsinki III, a grand bargain, a sphere of privileged interest, we'll take it through destabilization. Power is relative. If Russia is unable or unwilling to do structural economic reform and strengthen itself, then it can as an equalizer, weaken the West. And this is a form of parity equality. And also more recently, you have the notion of a Moscow consensus or neo-modernism in Russian thinking. In other words, it's not just a critique of the West, but they're now advancing an alternative market democratic paradigm, governance paradigm. And this, I think, comes hopefully after 8 minutes or so to the last 4 minutes of my presentation, which will look at how sustainable then is this model. Integrated chain of command, conventional, subconventional actors to destabilize the West and at the same time stabilize Russia. This is what we're saying. So how far can this go on? Well, there's really three alternative futures, I think, that are out there that we can analyze. The first is that Russia now is about to or is in the process of doing a strategic pivot, kiss and make up with the West. A Trump-Putin summit that allows for peaceful coexistence and selective détente with the West. That Russia needs to do this to get capital and technology from the West to exploit, for example, the Arctic. I think there are a number of reasons why this isn't likely to happen. Firstly, the role of anti-Americanism, again, where you have no politics or economy, in holding the system together, in center of gravity defense in Russia. If you're a besieged fortress, you need a dignified enemy, and Merkel does not equal Trump. So anti-Americanism is kind of hardwired, I think, into the system. Secondly, at least amongst Trump's national security elite, there's no misunderstanding and misperception and sense that if only we could talk, we could overcome these misunderstandings and misperception. There's a high degree of realism, I think, in the fact that Russians lie, Russian interlocutors lie and cannot be trusted. And we'll see with the ceasefire in southern Syria, how long that lasts. And we'll see also, can Putin resist the urge to try and drive a wedge between Trump's national security elite, so-called deep state, and Trump himself? I don't think they can. Leaking the Kislyak-Lavrov pictures from the White House, for example, was self-sabotage as far as I can see, but underscores Russia's need to have victories, tactical victories, even at the expense of strategic having better relations. You also have LNG exports, US coming from energy interdependence, hemispherically, to energy independent, to beginning to export. And Trump's also talked about an arms race. So you end up with Putin looking at 1986, where you had these conditions, but without perestroika, or without a plan B, essentially, which would be structural economic reform, which in his view leads to the end of the change and reform, would lead to the collapse of the system. Or if it was successful, essentially regime or leadership change. So he's not going to do that. The second option is kind of Big Bang revolution. 2017 is 1917. That the system's overloaded, the system's militarizing, resources are diminishing. There's a Czechistocracy. Czechists or Siloviki are fighting each other, cannibalizing each other. Manual control isn't working as well as it used to work. So this is a thesis put forward by Nikolai Petrov at the Higher School of Economics. And I think there's a number of reasons why this isn't going to happen. Society is acclimatizing. The elite have no option but Putin. There is no consensus or mechanism to get a consensus around an alternative to Putin. And the middle class have a lot to lose. And 200,000 of them can emigrate each year, and this acts as a safety valve. The system is much more adaptable than this thesis would suggest. There's still money in the system. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with the last option, and the option I think is most likely, and that is a kind of long goodbye scenario where you have stability plateaus and then mini crises. You have zastoj, stagnation, gradual degradation. I think actually Russia's crossed the critical threshold where they're hardwired or locked into this trajectory. And then if you start to look at some of the characteristics of that particular system, think of Democratic People's Republic of Korea. DPRK type outcome. This is a state in which organized crime is used and mainstreamed into the foreign policy to break sanctions. This is a state in which nuclear signaling occurs, and Putin's under pressure to demonstrate the political utility of these expensive weapons systems. It's a military-first approach. Guns ahead of butter. Bread takes a second role to battleships. It's autarky or juche in the North Korean understanding. That's self-sufficiency, and this is something Rogozin and the nationalists are talking a lot about. And it's essentially a G0 world order. It's a spoiler role in international affairs to act as an equalizer. And in this situation, I think, the risks of miscalculation, misperception, conflict escalation ladders increase. And Russia still has force multipliers it can use. The speed of the decision-making, for example, the geographical proximity it has to hotspots, regional hotspots or local hotspots, the military tactical ability and ability to exploit weaknesses that are there in states around Russia, the return on investment. As the economy shrinks, the return on investment increases. The strength of the belief in the center of gravity that state control of television is able to maintain, and the political will of a leader who knows he has no other option, essentially. And lastly, Western acquiescence, Western weakness in policy responses. And I think this is something that Matt will talk a little about when he looks at NATO's response. So I think the destabilization effort's here to stay, and it'll only increase. I'll be very happy to take any questions on that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I think that it should be a smooth transition. We've heard, I think, a good overview of the kind of challenge or threat that Russia has presented to the Euro-Atlantic community. I'll try to talk a little bit about what NATO in particular, as a core part of that community, has been doing to respond. We heard a little bit about this from Ambassador Birja this morning, and I'll try to fill in some additional areas. First, maybe a starting point is to recognize that this conference is taking place at almost exactly the one-year anniversary of NATO's summit here in Warsaw. I actually had an opportunity to participate during the summit at the parallel Warsaw Summit Experts Forum that was organized by NATO together with the Polish Institute of International Affairs here in Warsaw. While the adults were meeting in Warsaw National Stadium, about 300 other professors and experts, such as myself, were meeting in a circus tent across the parking lot. Sometimes this felt a little bit silly, but it was really interesting to hear firsthand from many of the people attending the main summit. And one of the opening speakers there was President Duda of Poland, and one thing that stuck with me was his remark that for him, this summit was the second most important thing that had happened for Poland since the end of the Cold War. And the only thing that topped it was entry to NATO itself. So for him, this was really a big deal. So what I'll try to do in my 12 or so minutes is to talk a little bit about why, for President Duda and other members, leaders of the alliance, Warsaw was so important, and try to reflect on where we are a year after that summit, what remains to be done for NATO to respond to the Russian threat, especially of hybrid warfare. Okay, for the Warsaw Summit itself, the headline outcome was something that I think will be familiar to many of you in this room. This initiative known as Enhanced Forward Presence. This was the initiative to finally have, on a rotational basis, 4 NATO battalion-sized battle groups stationed here in Poland under US leadership, in Lithuania under Germany, in Latvia under Canada, and in Estonia under British leadership. An additional 12 NATO countries are contributing to the forces in those various countries, either this year or next. These are now all in place. And so having this kind of presence on the ground was seen as an important reassurance for the countries involved, but also going beyond the simple kind of symbolic reassurance to a more robust defense and deterrence of Russian hybrid or conventional style warfare. It complemented a range of other military initiatives, both at Warsaw and previously, decisions to increase the number of NATO-led exercises in the region, the establishment of multinational brigade headquarters here in Poland and Romania, and an American bilateral initiative called the European